Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And it's another of our things. It's another one of our All Things Africa edition. Last week we explored the history and current affairs of Kenya. Today we'll be exploring the history and current affairs of one of the most fascinating countries on the continent, especially if you're a leftist of any kind, and that is Tanzania. And who better to teach us about this country, its body politic, and the legacy of one of its powerful leaders than our returning champion, Abayomi Azikiwe, the the founder and editor-in-chief of Pan-African Newswire, where he is a regular contributor. He's also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Report, and he's a regular guest on globalresearch.newshour.ca, CGTN, Press TV, and other left-leaning anti-imperial publications. So first off, Abayomi, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for your ongoing interest in developments on the continent.
Well, thank you for always taking the time to teach us all about this, and also don't forget, folks. Please share widely One Plus One's works, both old and new episodes, our playlists, and help us overcome not only the far right algorithms, but the still dominant corporate media and Western state media that has an unjust advantage on the algorithm. So anytime you share One Plus One, you're helping a great deal. And please donate to One Plus One as well as to Abayomi's work. We're entirely independent media, so do donate generously if you can, or however much if you can. It's all greatly appreciated. And so on to the topic at hand. So Tanzania, Abayomi, this is actually one hell of a fascinating country when I was researching it. But before we talk about Tanzania and what it was after independence, let's of course start at the beginning, which was what was Tanzania like before British colonialism, and when Britain took over, describe colonialism and some of the hideous practices of British colonialists and some of the unjust policies of Anglo-colonialism in Tanzania. And then my only other follow-up question to that is, what are some of the terrible legacies of colonialism that Tanzania has still yet to overcome, even in the year 2025?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come back on One Plus One. Prior to British colonialism in East Africa, particularly in Tanganyika, the Germans were there. In fact, the German East African colony was established beginning in the 1880s by a man named Dr. Karl Peters, a very ruthless colonialist who had very limited business background. He attempted to set up the German East Africa Company, which met with repeated economic and business failures. But he was a very ruthless, racist, colonialist agent of Germany. We remember that the Berlin Conference was held in late 1884 and 1885. In fact, 140 years ago is being commemorated over the last several months, that this important conference took place that brought together all of these different European colonial powers. They divided up the African continent. It was considered a giant African cake, which was divided by Europe. The US was there, but they had initially a limited role in the whole process. So in 1884, 1885, the Germans moved into East Africa, and particularly Tanganyika, Uganda, as well as parts of Kenya. Prior to that, of course, you had the development of city-states along the East African coast on the Indian Ocean basin. And those states were carved out of fortified village communities. They were involved in trade, particularly in agricultural products, and of course in slavery as well during the 19th century. The slave trade was largely focused on the nation of Oman, which is in West Asia. And the British also cooperated with this process, although they claimed to have outlawed the slave trade in the early 1800s.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So Zanzibar, which is off the coast of Tanzania, became a colony, more or less, of the Sultan of Oman. And there was a lot of transfer of human beings as well as agricultural products from the East African coast to West Asia. What happened during that entire period was that the British, of course, coveted the trade that was going on in East Africa along the coast. And then when World War I arrived, of course, Germany lost out in that entire imperialist process. At the Treaty of Versailles in Paris in 1919, the German East Africa colonies were awarded to Britain. And of course, the Belgians were quite angry about this, and they protested it. They had to negotiate with the British, and they were given what is today Rwanda and Uganda. That's how the Belgians took over those areas, which were previously controlled by Germany.
Fascinating. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, this inter-imperialist rivalry, which had been going on for many, many years, came to fruition after the conclusion of World War I. And prior to that even, there were revolts that took place in Tanganyika. We know about the Maji Maji revolt. That is perhaps the most well-known revolt in East Africa that took place between 1905 and 1907, where the indigenous African people rose up against the German colonialists. The colonialists had taken people's lands, they had forced them off of their traditional lands, and they were also forced to pay taxes to the Germans. As a result of that, the people rose up in rebellion. Many Africans were killed, thousands, tens of thousands were killed. They were placed in internment camps, and that somewhat consolidated German imperialism in East Africa. Nonetheless, as I mentioned before, after World War I, the British came in and took over, and this initiated a whole new series of rebellions during that particular time period. There was also, unrest even prior to the period of 1905 to 1907. In the 1890s, there were rebellions and revolts by the indigenous people in Tanganyika. So after World War I, of course, the British took over, but the conditions under which the Treaty of Versailles was developed led to the rise of fascism in several European countries. You could look at Italy, and later in Germany, Italy in 1921, 1922 under Mussolini, and then the growth of the so-called German National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi Party in Germany, during the late 1920s, and of course in 1932, Hitler was able to acquire about 1/3 of the vote in the Bundestag, the Reichstag, and of course after that, he convinced the other 2/3 of the German parliament to make him chancellor. And after he was made chancellor, of course, he consolidated power under his own authority, which took less than 2 months. I think it's similar to the same playbook that the Trump administration is using right now. They just don't have the militias, they don't have the party to go out and beat up people and kill people. That's what they're lacking in. And they've also have been talking about creating a private police force. But in terms of the situation in Tanganyika after the rise of British colonialism, it became what they call a protectorate of London. After World War II, of course, there was a tremendous amount of damage that was done. Germany was destroyed. Italy was taken over by the Allied powers. And then, of course, the national liberation struggles emerged full blown, somewhat during the war, but actually after 1945, we saw various organizations that came to the fore. In Tanganyika, you had what was called the Tanganyika African Association. That was heavily rooted in the development of cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, to get better prices for agricultural products from the British colonialists. It eventually evolved into a liberation movement, the Tanganyika African National Union, headed by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who was a school teacher, very well read, very skilled in terms of tactical efforts and strategic outlooks involving African liberation. They continued their struggle and their demands for liberation. And this was taking place within the context of other developments on the continent. For example, in 1951, Libya was given its independence in North Africa. In 1952, there was the officers' coup in Egypt, which brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power, and he consolidated his power 2 years later in 1954. In 1956, we had the independence of Sudan, and also we had the so-called war over the control of the Suez Canal in Egypt, where the British attempted to retake the Suez Canal after it had been nationalized by Nasser. So all of these things were going on. In Ghana, of course, the liberation struggle accelerated after 1947, 1948, when Kwame Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast. In 1951, the first elections were held in the Gold Coast, in which the Convention People's Party won the overwhelming majority of the vote. Kwame Nkrumah was made leader of government business. In 54, he was made prime minister after another election. In 56, it was decided that the atmosphere was right for independence. And on March 6th of 1957, Ghana was evolved out of the Gold Coast colony. So similar developments were taking place in Tanganyika. And in 1961, there was the first election, multi-party, non-racial election, which was won by the Tanganyika African National Union. The following year, Tanganyika became a republic. Nyerere became a president. He was made prime minister the year before. And in 1964 in Zanzibar, which had been, as I mentioned before, a source of trade, enslavement, and monarchical collaboration with British imperialism, there was an uprising in 1964, a revolution in which they overturned the feudal interests in Zanzibar, and the Afro-Shirazi Party came into being. And it, of course, decided to unite with the mainland of Tanganyika, and it became the United Republic of Tanzania in late 1964. So that's just some aspects of the struggle against colonialism, the struggle for unity. And of course, after 1964, a new phase developed, and that was the phase that emerged after the Arusha Declaration of 1967, which called for the building of a socialist Tanzania.
Fascinating. And actually, before we talk about that, just a quick follow-up is what are some of the legacies of colonialism that even a country like Tanzania is still struggling to overcome in the year 2025?
Largely involving dependency on the Western imperialist countries, the need to industrialize. That, of course, is a direct result from the colonial legacy. The British and all the other colonial powers, the only development they really brought to the colonies were centered around the exploitation of natural resources and labor. So development for the people and the people's interests is something that had to develop after independence. But being at a disadvantage as a result of centuries of enslavement and colonialism has hampered the capacity of African states to industrialize and also to transform the relations of production from a capitalist system to a socialist system. That was attempted in Tanzania. Of course, it has not been reached completely at this stage, but it was part of that whole process during the 1960s and 1970s to build socialism in several African countries.
Fascinating, and that's a perfect segue to this question. So, talk to us about the first democratically elected leader of Tanzania. You already mentioned him, Julius Nyerere. Is that how you say his name?
Nyerere, we usually pronounce it that way in North America. Yes, and he was a school teacher, as I mentioned, and a very brilliant philosopher who had his own ideas about African unity, about world affairs. And what made it somewhat easier in Tanzania is the development of the Kiswahili language as a lingua franca, so to speak. Many people in the country speak it. Many people throughout East Africa speak the language. It was a language used through trade and also through administrative structures under Germany as well as under Britain. So the fact that you have millions and millions of people throughout the East Africa region that speak this language has facilitated greater unity and, of course, political development in Tanzania, the United Republic of Tanzania. But people have been speaking that language for centuries. As I mentioned, it grew out of the relationship between the indigenous African people, the people of the Omani, the country of Oman, which is a West Asian Arabic country, and also the Persians as well. And from what is considered today modern day Iran, were also involved in trade, and many of them settled as well in Zanzibar. So he had a mix of Arab, Persian, and African cultures, which brought about the peoples of modern day Tanzania.
Fascinating. And actually, tell us more about his legacy, because he served as president and I think prime minister, holding both positions oftentimes. And he served as leader of Tanzania from roughly 1964 to 1985. How do you assess his legacy as a Pan-Africanist leftist? And please do tell us the good and the bad of his legacies.
He was made prime minister in 1961. He became president in 1962. They had a lot of work to do. As I mentioned before, colonialism fostered underdevelopment in Africa. He was instrumental in advocating for the East Africa community. He was also a co-founder of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. And he built the University of Dar es Salaam, which became a center in the 1960s and 1970s of debate over the future of Africa and also over the character of socialism in post-colonial Africa. There are many scholars who came to the fore during that particular time period who had their own ideas about what Tanzania's role should be. People like Walter Rodney, for example, who was from Guyana, wound up in Tanzania in 1966 after he completed his PhD from London University. And he taught there off and on between 1966 and 1974. The book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, was actually written.
A book I still need to get.
Fascinating
I've
book.
read passages of it, really, and it's brilliant stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, after 52 years, 53 years now, the book is still holds up very well in terms of his approach to the whole question of African underdevelopment and the development of Europe and North America. But it wasn't just him. There were others as well who were there, who went there to study, who went there to teach, and also the Tanzanian scholars who also wrote on aspects of socialism and socialist development. Isa Shiji is another East Indian Tanzanian scholar who wrote a book, compiled a book called Class Struggles in Tanzania. And there were many others that taught there. Yash Tandon was one. I believe he was initially from Uganda, who took refuge there and taught at the University of Dar es Salaam. And there were also white European scholars who were there too, from Canada and other places. So it was quite of an interesting period in Tanzania. James Forman, in his book, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, talked about his visit to Tanzania in 1967. And he went to a bookstore there, a socialist bookstore that was sponsored by the People's Republic of China. And he was saying it was there that he acquired a lot of literature on socialism, particularly from the Communist Party of China, then under Mao Zedong. So yeah, these are some of the advances that Tanzania had put forward during this time period. Also, it's very important to mention that the liberation movements in Southern Africa, a lot of them were based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. They were there studying, organizing, and doing all types of international solidarity work during the 1960s and 1970s. So it has been a very, very important country in regard to the struggle against colonialism in Africa and for socialism worldwide.
Now we did an entire episode devoted to Eritrea, which is a radical socialist country that has been both that has been like Cuba, North Korea. It's been battered by U.S.-led sanctions and economic terrorism for its radical socialism, just like Cuba and North America. And it's a miracle Eritrea has managed to persevere. Now, Tanzania itself is very much a socialist country, but it has kind of both the positives and negatives of socialism. So Tanzania's approach to socialism with African or Tanzanian characteristics has seen it trying to approach socialism in various degrees with social democratic elements, Western social democratic elements. It is a one-party state with different factions led or dominated by the left wing or the left-leaning Chama Chai Mapinduzi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, it's a Kiswahili word. Yeah, Chama Chai Mapinduzi, the
yes,
Revolutionary Party of the People. Yeah,
exactly. And that party has been associated with the International Social Democrats center-left parties known as Socialist International, and it's even been a member of its sister organization, the Progressive Alliance, which is supposed to be a successor alternative to Socialist International, but one can dispute how much of an alternative it really is based on some of the powerful members in that group. But anywho, but Tanzania, despite it being a one-party state, there's hardly been anyone, international semi-NGOs from the West or Western-funded semi-NGOs, that characterize Tanzania's system as authoritarianism. And Tanzania is one of the African countries that has seen, that's often seen as being one of the more fairly stable countries in the continent. So my question to you is, how do you assess the CCM, which has held power democratically from the Cold War to the age of the 90s to the unipolar world dominated by capitalist countries led by the US as the unchallenged superpower, to the 2010s, where we saw an attempted rise of neo-multipolarity, a failed African-Arab Spring, and a new wave of former French colonies challenging French neo-colonialism in the country. So explain to us Tanzania's leadership in the Cold War and its legacy, followed by those in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s.
Yes, the Arusha Declaration, and that document is still available online. People should look it up and read it. It calls for the development of socialism in Tanzania. It sets certain guidelines in regard to people who work for the government, who hold public office. It puts limits on how much personal property they can own and what their behavior should be on an economic and political basis. And that document generated a lot of debate and discussion. Some people said it did not go far enough in regard to socialism. Others said that they thought it was a fine document, that it was appropriate for building socialism on the African continent. Walter Rodney wrote an essay in 1971 called Ujamaa and Scientific Socialism. Ujamaa is a Kiswahili word which means collective work and responsibility. And Ujamaa was the socialist process that was instituted under the Tanzania National African Union during the late 1960s. The party was transformed from TANU to the CCM in 1977, but it's basically the same ideological orientation from TANU to the CCM. So if people read the Arusha Declaration, they can see what the views were of the ruling party at that time as it relates to the construction of socialism inside the country. But as I said, others, particularly around the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, engaged in pretty furious debates in the late 60s and the early 1970s over the character of the system in Tanzania. And there were efforts as well to try to reform the university system. So it was a lot of debate and discussion that was going on during that particular time period. There has never been a military coup in the United Republic of Tanzania since its formation in 1964. Even prior to that, there's never been a military coup, although there have been some internal problems within the military. And there was a plot to engage in a coup, purportedly a left-wing oriented coup during the late 1960s, which was not successful. So overall, Tanzania has been a very stable country all of these years. It has numerous ethnicities there, perhaps over 100 ethnicities. But I believe the fact that Tanzania is the national language, that almost everybody that lives there speaks the language, could have had a lot to do with the fact of maintaining its stability. Also, the ideas advanced by Julius Nyerere, which were against tribalism, against ethnic divisions, and call for one unified Tanzanian people, could also have had a lot to do with the fact that the country has never undergone a civil war or a military coup over the last 64 years. It will be 64 years this year. Yes.
Fascinating. And how do you assess Tanzania's foreign policy with regards to first the continent of Africa, its attitudes to its attitudes towards American-led imperialism, its attitudes and relations with Britain, its former colonialists, and pan-Europeanism of the EU, NATO alliances, and what's Tanzania's attitude towards the rising BRICS, particularly China and Russia?
The country, the ruling party, has maintained close ties with the Communist Party of China for decades. A lot of their programs were based on the Chinese socialist model. They were more allied with China rather than the former USSR. And of course, this had a lot to do with the development of the liberation movements in Southern Africa as well. They've never been hostile. They were never hostile to the former Soviet Union or the current Russia, but they have maintained very close ties to the People's Republic of China. And in fact, they built a railroad there during the early 1970s that connected Tanzania with neighboring Zambia. It's a vast country. It has approximately 67 million people there. And they are a non-aligned state. And they have not joined the Brazil, Russia, India, China Plus Summit. But I am certain they would very much be interested in becoming a part of it or an affiliate of the BRICS Summit. And Tanzania right now is headed by a woman president who took over after the previous death of the previous head of state. And Salima Hassan is a very, very competent woman leader, and she's going to be seeking re-election during the next period. I think the elections are coming up later on this year. But yes, they are members of the African Union. They're part of the non-aligned movement, and they do want international peace and security, and that is largely what they stand on. They're co-founders of the Southern African Developmental Coordinating Conference, which preceded the Southern African Development Community. And they have also participated in some peacekeeping operations, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the East, where it was just announced that these SADC peacekeeping force would be drawn down from Eastern DRC. It would be a gradual drawing down of that force after the killing of the South African troops and Malawian troops that took place just a few weeks back.
Actually, before I ask this question, I do have to ask this as a follow-up question because you mentioned that Tanzania has been part of the non-aligned movement, and do you think there are some flaws in that mentality Tanzania has when it comes to, well, we want good relations with the West, we want good relations with the former USSR and and the rising BRICS nations, particularly China and Russia. I'm curious if you have any criticisms when it comes to Tanzania's neutrality, non-aligned stance.
Historically, the non-aligned movement has leaned more towards the progressive forces internationally. If we look at the founders of it, people like Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, we had Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, Nehru in Egypt, and the others from Indonesia. They have not been looked at favorably by the Western imperialist countries. In fact, today, the non-aligned movement has called, for example, for the end of the war in Ukraine. They have allied themselves with the struggle of the Palestinians. They've opposed the genocide that is going on right now. But your point is well taken because this has come up. People who say that, no, there's no such thing as being non-aligned. Either you're with the struggle for socialism or you're with the efforts to maintain capitalism worldwide. But at the same time, many of the countries who are part of the non-aligned movement, for example, the Republic of Cuba, clearly is on the side of socialism worldwide. So I think that today, the non-aligned movement represents more than half of the world's population. And if you asked the leadership of that movement right now, which is in Uganda, what their position was on many of these questions, they would not be in alliance with the United States. So today, many people speak of multipolarity or pluripolarity, which is opposed to the unipolarity in which the United States is still pushing. Even under the previous government of Joe Biden, that was their position. Even under Barack Obama, he talked about American exceptionalism. And today, under Donald Trump, the rhetoric is even more harsh, that the US should dominate all over the world, even Europe. They're calling for the escalation of defense budgets among European Union member states and Britain. They are calling for the colonization of Greenland, as well as Canada. So this American exceptionalism or American imperialism is still very much alive today, despite what many people were convinced to believe that Trump would not pursue international military adventures and imperialist efforts, that he would focus more on building up the US economy, bringing down prices, and improving the living conditions of people inside the United States. That has not happened. It's not been one executive order calling for the freezing of grocery prices, not one executive order calling for the freezing of petroleum prices. None of that has taken place. All we see are threats against other countries. And interestingly enough, other imperialist countries like Denmark, Canada, the European Union, and the
Exactly.
UK. So this is a very, very interesting period that we're living in right now. It's not just Somaliland that's under threat, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they're negotiating some type of critical minerals agreement to provide minerals to the United States in exchange for US troops on the ground to guard against the M23 rebels and others in Eastern DRC. All of these are imperialist maneuvers on the part of the United States. So in terms of the non-aligned movement, I think overall it is on the side of the peoples of the global South, and it will continue in that direction as the world moves more towards multipolarity.
Fascinating. And, we've seen in Africa, we've seen social democratic leaders like Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Zaire, DRC, which you mentioned, overthrown in Western-backed coups. And we see Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, arguably social democratic, but certainly a Marxist, also overthrown in the Western-backed coup. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, who I thought was Lumumba meets Nkrumah. I mean, the best of both worlds in terms of social democracy and being an African Marxist. And again, democratically backed and elected, had a mandate, but overthrown in a Western backed coup. Then you get nations like Eritrea or Angola who want to go even more radical Marxist Leninist or communist, and the U.S. and its allies just light them, just light those countries on fire, or countries like Ethiopia on fire by instigating civil wars, supporting reactionary secessionist movements, or getting their proxies and other African countries to sabotage their much needed radical programs. Now, how did Tanzania avoid the fate of being overthrown in a Western-backed coup or met with economic terrorism, given it's literally a democratic socialist, albeit a one-party state in Africa? Uh, it overthrew the government of Idi Amin, which was backed by the US, the UK, Canada, Israel, and Saudi Arabia for years and years. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Tanzania wasn't punished for ousting this Western-backed serial killer with low-level IQ. So I'm curious your response to why that is. Tanzania allowed its right to exist with its particular forms of socialism.
Well, that's a good question. And in regard to what happened in 1979, when the Tanzanian Defense Forces went into Uganda, and that resulted in the overthrow of Idi Amin, who was also a very interesting character. When he first came in, the initial coup had been backed by the US, Britain, and the State of Israel. But after he stayed in office for a while, he started to take positions, like, for example, in support of the people in Palestine. And this infuriated those in the West. And then, of course, the raid at Entebbe, which took place, I believe, in 1976, which Benjamin Netanyahu's brother was killed in a rescue operation during that period, kind of put Idi Amin in a negative light as far as the West was concerned. But Amin had a lot of issues in terms of internal problems. And when he attacked Julius Nyerere publicly and claimed that that area in which they went into in Tanzania actually belonged to Uganda, he actually set the stage for his own overthrow, which took place just several weeks later. His soldiers fled when the Tanzanian Defense Forces came in. And of course, the history of Uganda is complex as well after 1979, the coups that took place between 1979, then the bringing back of Milton Obote, who was overthrown by Idi Amin in 1971. Obote had been a progressive president, had been an Nkrumah, had very close ties with Kwame Nkrumah, even after the coup. So after the 1966 coup against Nkrumah. So yes, I think Tanzania's efforts are heroic in terms of being able to maintain unity inside the country and thwarting any efforts at destabilization and attempted military coups and the sparking of a civil war inside the country. They've been able to avoid all of that so far, and we'll see what happens in the next few months, in the next few years, as the whole process continues to unfold.
Fascinating. And now, despite Tanzania's best efforts and numerous great socialist policies that they've implemented, Tanzania, like all of its mostly majority Black African population, we still see obscene levels of absolute poverty. And with that, people are still plagued with illiteracy, diseases which should be easily treatable. People are still dying from hunger. And Tanzania, surprisingly, has still fallen prey to predatory loans from the IMF and I believe the World Bank too. And Canadian mining companies and other multinational Western corporations do continue to run roughshod over the Tanzanian majority working poor and destitute poor majority. And often, when Tanzania tries to hold corporations who engage in human rights abuses, often they've been prevented from the threat that they themselves will be sued if they cancel contracts and prosecute the perpetrators of gross human rights abuses. Now, is this because Tanzania isn't radical enough in its anti-neocolonial policies, or does this show us the severe limitations of social democracy that thinks you can radically reform or tame capitalism, or does Tanzania demonstrate what our Trotskyist friends often say, that you can't have socialism in one country, that the entire continent of Africa needs to be collectively free, and if several of Tanzania's neighbors are under the thumb of Western-backed goons like Uganda under Yoweri Museveni, Rwanda under Paul Kagame, Zaire, DRC Congo, often it's often very weak leaders or puppet leaders, and to various degrees Tanzania plus the Horn of Africa, which is often unstable. Much of that is due to Western imperialism, and then that often makes it very hard for a supposedly stable country like Tanzania or similar places like Botswana or Benin to flourish. I'm curious. Yes, so I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah, in the mid 1980s, the United Republic of Tanzania did accept an IMF conditioned program in the country, which cut back on government spending. And this was a pattern that was taking place in various African states. You mentioned Uganda, for example. They accepted it later in the 1980s after Museveni took over. And Museveni, for example, had been in Tanzania and had studied at the University of Dar es Salaam. So he did have somewhat of a left-wing exposure. Nonetheless, when he came in office, he went pretty far to the right in regard to accepting the so-called economic recovery programs and the structural adjustment programs prescribed, by the U.S.-based International Monetary Fund and World Bank. That also happened in Ghana too, during the 1980s under Jerry Rawlings. Ghana and Uganda went further than any other state in terms of accepting the IMF conditionalities. So these are problems that African states are facing, and irrespective of what Leon Trotsky may have said, people like Kwame Nkrumah during the 1960s essentially said the same thing, that the only way to defeat neocolonialism is to bring about a United States of Africa, to integrate the economies, the military apparatuses, and all aspects of African societies, to integrate them into one unified state. And I still believe today that that is the only real solution that Africa faces, and people of African descent all over the world. There has to be unity. And we've seen even the African Union, when it was reformed from the Organization of African Unity, based upon the CERT Declaration of 1999 that was negotiated in Libya under the Jemahariya prior to the destruction of the country in 2011. In 2002, the AU, when it was formed, its charter goes much further than what the OAU charter did, but it still has not been able to be realized. You have an African continental free trade area that has been established, yet it is largely unoperational to this point. So there has to be a struggle for unity. There has to be a struggle against imperialism, and that is the only way that these issues can be resolved. And we see efforts moving in that direction. The Alliance of Sahel States, for example, the AES, is attempting this, but they have tremendous obstacles. They were colonized by the French. They have rebel groups there that are funded in all likelihood by the imperialists. We know in Mali, it's already been uncovered that Ukraine was funding these so-called jihadist groups to destabilize the Malian government.
Wow.
And undoubtedly it's going on in Niger and in Burkina Faso as well. So Africa has to unite in order to defeat neo-colonialism, to bring about its own independence and sovereignty away from the IMF and the World Bank. And what's going on right now in Eastern DRC is an excellent example of why the continent has to unite. It has to be responsible for its own internal security. And that is the major challenge that we face and have faced since the 1960s, since the days of Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah, Ahmed Sékou Touré, and the others, and Julius Nyerere.
And final question then is, do you think Tanzania is the perfect do you think Tanzania is the perfect model for African socialism that other states in Africa should emulate? Curious your response.
I think there are many aspects of the Tanzanian political experiment that do warrant replication or attempted replication by other countries in Africa. However, at the same time, you're going to run into the same difficulties that we've seen in other countries. What we've seen in Ghana, for example, which was a progressive socialist-oriented state under Nkrumah up to 1966. Nyerere, socialist-oriented state up until the mid-1980s, and it's still within the constitution of the CCM that their objective is to move towards socialism. The fact that they have not had a military coup, there's not been a civil war, that they have collectively attempted to battle impoverishment and sectional divisions inside the country is clearly a model for the rest of Africa, but it is not perfect. No country on the continent at this stage can be considered perfect. There's a lot of work to be done, and there needs to be unity, and there needs to be a struggle against imperialism on the African continent. That is the only way that the country can overcome its difficulties. Inviting the US in, for example, to provide a security apparatus is not going to work. We've seen historically what has happened. Look what happened in the 1960s with the succession of Katanga, for example, in what's today known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, when it was actually used as a base for subversion. It was the place where Patrice Lumumba was taken for torture and execution in 1961. We don't want that replicated again in the third decade of the 21st century. So the DRC, Tanzania, all of the countries have to come up with their own methods of resolving the internal contradictions, and they're going to get worse because now the Trump administration has cut virtually all assistance to African states, whether it's on a medical level, food assistance, assistance related to infectious diseases, and infrastructure have largely been dissipated. But at the same time, as President Cyril Ramaphosa noted last week, this is a wake-up call for the African continent, and that Africa has to become more self-reliant and move away from dependency on the Western imperialist states. And it also provides openings for the People's Republic of China, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also the Russian Federation to get involved in even more joint projects with African Union member states, whether it's related to medical issues, infrastructural questions, food distribution and growing. All of that is very important. And that's why the AU took a position against the ongoing war in Ukraine, because they realized that the disruption of supply chains in regard to agricultural products has contributed immensely to the food deficits that we've seen in Africa over the last 3 years.
Interesting. Well, we were joined on this. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to end. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with arguably the best historian and journalist on all things Africa, our good friend and always returning champion Abayomi Azikiwe, the founder and editor-in-chief of Pan-African Newswire, where he himself is a regular contributor, and he's also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Report. Make sure, folks, you're subscribed to both outlets, and you donate generously to both. And please, and again, please support Abayomi's incredible independent journalism and history work. And don't forget, folks, please share widely 1+1's work, both old and new episodes, and our playlists, and help us overcome not only the far-right algorithms, but the still dominant corporate media and Western state media that has an unjust advantage in the algorithms. So anytime you share 1+1, you're helping a great deal, and please donate to 1+1 because we're entirely independent, so donate however much you can. All my best until then. Have a great weekend. And the next country that we'll be exploring will be in the African continent will be Uganda. So check us out for that next week or the week after. And until then, good night and good luck and all my best, folks.